Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. As you will quickly notice, I'm not very comfortable, not very at ease speaking in English. So I'd like to begin by to apologize for this. my first idea was to speak in French with the vague excuse that I was the local guy and that one speaks better about the concept of local in one's mother tongue. But obviously this is not true. And it would have been unfair to those of you who are not French speaking. Anyway, I'll try to make it clear and to make it short. So now, is it okay for you?
I think you need to press the full screen button. Yes, correct. Thank you.
Okay. So about the title, sorry. The title, which has been kept in French. Genève internationale versus génie du lieu, enquête sur une architecture acclimatée. I presume everybody understands the term génie du lieu, genius loci in Latin, spirit of place in English, especially those of you who have read the books of Christian Norberg Schulz. The French expression Genève internationale, however, is not so easy to translate. It's a very common expression in French used to designate the city from a cosmopolitan point of view. As you know, Geneva brings many international organizations together and many people from all around the world. But what is also important to know is that before the 20th century, the city was already considered an open, shared place frequented by several nationalities, even if these nationalities were limited to Europe. As an illustration of this, we can read in a sort of guide from the beginning of the 20th century. I will translate. Geneva has nothing that makes a foreigner feel disoriented. And although it's far from his home and his worries, the French find there its elegance, the English its comfort, the Italian its climate, the German its way of life, and the Russian conspires in freedom. Here, every flaneur, stroller feels at ease. So I don't want to discuss the nationalist cliché. The question here is not whether all this is true or false, but to grasp the extent to which this idea of openness is linked to the city, or rather to grasp how this idea of openness helps here to build the image of the city with an eminently touristic goal. What I would like to do in my presentation is to show on an architectural level that the City of Geneva embodies this constant openness to foreign models, and this has been the case since the 19th century. And what is obviously interesting for the theme of the day is to see to what extent the page and the screen play decisive roles, both in the circulations of models, but also in research work in the history of architecture. And this is where I want to begin. I'm going to begin, which is what you do, what you have to do when you work on the history of a building in a city where you live, in a city that is familiar to you. I begin taking the example of a landmark, the Musérat. It's a museum built in 1826, and which is the first Swiss museum built as such, And in addition to the museum above, here you can see the picture of the wall next to my desk, as it was when I was working on the case. It's a kind of board where several images are put together, images that come from books, photos taken by myself, or from the internet, of course. The first observation that can be made is the parallel between what you have in front of you and what we see in almost all detective movies and series, namely the investigation board or detective board in the police station, where you can see images of the victims, the suspects, and their relatives, with arrows pointing to their relationships. This board, as you know, is crucial for the investigation. It's not a page, it's not a screen, it is something else which reveals connections. And what I wanted to underline here with this display of images is the attempt to bring out what we could call the circumstances, not of a crime, but of a building. That is to say, what surrounds an object and allows us to grasp its identity. For this example, what appears first is the neoclassical shape that the building shares with other museums of the same period. The Hunterian Museum in Glasgow on the left, and the Glyptothek in München on the right. Through this architectural language, the Musérat is connected to other buildings of the same family. In a certain way, neoclassicism is a kind of international style that ignores local specificities. In this case, it is the typological or stylistic family that puts in relation buildings from different towns. In other cases, it's the biographical link that connects the building of Geneva with foreign constructions, sometimes in a very surprising way. By biographical link, I mean the identification of the protagonists of a building, the owner, the architect, the carpenter, etc. In the majority of cases, these identities are not published, they are not on internet, they are hidden in the archive. A few years ago, I was asked to write something about this house, a very modest house in a popular neighborhood of Geneva, more precisely in a street called in the 19th century, Chemin des Étrangers, Stranger's Path. In the notarial archive, I learned that it had been built for a man called Henry Liszt, sorry, Henry Liszt, a defrocked priest, native of Hanover, who had converted to teaching German. So far, there is nothing exceptional, but after having speculated, Henry Liszt went bankrupt, emigrated to the USA with his family, and in Boston, on the 3rd of September 1956, his daughter gave birth to Louis Sullivan. Yes, you have heard correctly, Louis Sullivan, one of the most famous American architects, the man who gave Chicago the reputation of architectural capital. In short, the little house in Geneva had been built for the grandfather of the man who is considered to be the father of the skyscraper and modernism. So, what is the point of this? Nothing can be said. It's purely anecdotic. It would be absurd to claim a causality from one on the other. Anyway, the chain of coincidences and necessity is fascinating, or at least amazing. So in many ways, the buildings of Geneva are connected to those of the rest of the world. Most of the time, the connection is more meaningful than the example of the grandfather of Louis Sullivan. I will take a few examples of the 19th and 20th century, emphasizing the flow, circulation, and transfer. As I have already said, neoclassicism is during the 19th century a kind of lingua franca, an architectural Esperanto. In Geneva, it's significant that the rise of neoclassicism occurred at the same time as the demolition of what is called locally dome, which are porticos made of wood that protect the front of the houses. These elements were vernacular, that is to say, the result of a local tradition. They were place-specific. The demolition of the domes thus led Geneva to lose one of its original architectural form, or at least an aspect which was specific to the city. A similar phenomenon affected the city's soil. As early as the 1830s, the river Pebble, picked up on the banks of the river, disappeared in favor of a paving cut in the German style with imported stones. The internationalization of the architectural language, the disappearance of regionalism, the changes in materials and know-how, all these phenomena contributed to the shaping from the first half of the 19th century of the new face of the city. But it was the demolition of the fortification in the middle of the 19th century, the opening of a railway line, and above all, the development of the architectural press that accelerated the adoption of hitherto unknown types, styles, and materials. The new cult buildings are the most eloquent sign of this change. By their architecture, the synagogue and the Orthodox Church refer to the East, or rather to two Easts, two Orients. The synagogue is a building qualified in the 19th century as Moorish, but the architect of the building had never been in Palestine, Egypt, Maghreb, or Andalusia. On the other hand, he traveled to Germany and was certainly aware of the architectural periodical Allgemeine Bauzeitung, published in Vienna, in which the synagogue of Heidenheim was published. As you can see, the Genevan architect was very inspired by this building to the point of reproducing the main facade line for line. It is true that the Geneva synagogue is Orientalist. In fact, certain motifs derive from Hispano-Moorish architecture, such as the mosque in Cordoba, but it's more accurate to consider it as stemming from second-hand Orientalism, mediatized and filtered by Germany. The Russian Church is a completely different case. Its architect, a professor at the St. Petersburg School of Fine Arts, had never set foot in Geneva. He designed the building in his office in St. Petersburg. Local architects were in charge of executing the plans. The church is undoubtedly Russian. One could almost say that it overplays Russia in a nationalist style that borrows from both Byzantine and Muscovite architecture. It is Russian in form, but not in substance, because unlike the Russian churches built in Russia, which are made of brick, the one in Geneva is made of stone. As brick is not part of Geneva's construction habits, the building has been naturalized in a way by using materials from the region. If one compares the Russian church in Geneva to its almost twin sister church designed by the same architect and built in the vicinity of St. Petersburg, one realizes that to what extent the form and type are the same, but the substance is different. These cult buildings summon distant references, exotic forms. They are not the only ones to embody a new era of openness. Indeed, the decades following the demolition of the fortification welcomed with open arms what came from elsewhere, and especially from Paris. Let's take the case of a fountain, a fountain sold by catalog by a famous Parisian manufacturer. The municipality of Geneva wanted to provide the city with a fountain that would live up to their ambitions. They looked at the catalog, they went up to Paris, acquired the fountain, and installed it in the Jardin Anglais, a public garden, in 1863. But they were not the only ones to make this choice. Angers, Lyon, Tours, Bordeaux, Lisbon, Boston, Valparaiso, Buenos Aires, etc. All these cities choose the same model marketed worldwide. All these fountains, are these fountains identical? Yes and no, because each municipality could customize its own fountain by adding cast iron dolphins or frogs, giving the basin a particular shape. Anyway, the diffusion of the same model is massive and massively increased by the postcard, a kind of flying page. You have a few copies of them on this slide. In the monumental field, the taste for the foreign reference may be due to individual initiative. The Duke of Brunswick, who died in Geneva in 1873, bequeathed his entire fortune to the city, and in return, he asked that a mausoleum be built in his memory. He indicated precisely the shape of the monument in a drawing that he added to his will. It must have been a copy of the mausoleum of the Scaligeri family, built in Verona in the 14th century. Something has to be noticed here. The Geneva mausoleum is larger than the Italian model. Of course, architecture does not have the same mobility as the fountain I showed to you, nor the same status as the monument of the Duke of Brunswick. Nevertheless, the models developed at the Paris School of Fine Arts, l'École des Beaux-Arts, spread throughout the world, and Geneva welcomed them without restraint. When the company of electric rail tramways decided to build its headquarters, it opted for a typically French formula, typically Beaux-Arts, in the silhouette, in the style, in the details. If the formula is very common, the identity of the architect is surprising. His name is Harvey Willie Corbett. He was originally from Chicago, from San Francisco. And when he was commissioned by the Geneva company, he was 26 years old and had not yet completed the studies at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Corbett did his architectural drawing in Paris. He came to Geneva to build his first building and then went to the United States to build the Baltimore School of Fine Arts before accomplishing a phenomenal career in the construction of skyscrapers. The headquarters in Geneva, here you can see it on the left, has all the characteristics of French public architecture, but it's also the cornerstone of a long and rich professional career. Trajectory across the Atlantic and beyond in the imagination, since the visionary drawings commissioned by Corbett, which you have here on your right, probably inspired Fritz Lang for his Metropolis, as well as the creators of Gotham City, the city of Batman. Let's come to Geneva. At the turn of the 20th century, major cultural public buildings appeared, such as the Museum of Art and History. The city did not want to be outdone in terms of sumptuous public buildings. In the case of the museum, the reference is aristocratic. You have on the left the large windows of the museum, and on the right the model, namely the Chapelle Royale in Versailles. Obviously, it's not a detail. The reference is a captation. It's full of meaning, expressing the desire to establish a prestigious genealogy. But it's even more than that. As a building type, the museum wants here to look like a church. In other words, a sacred place. In short, the Versailles model dignify and sacralize the museum. In the development of modern architecture from the 20s onward, there was a shift in focus towards Germany and Austria. In someone like the local architect Maurice Braillard, for example, whose round house you have on the left, compared with the Karl-Marx-Hof in Vienna. It's not sure that Braillard went to Vienna. Maybe he knew the Karl-Marx-Hof by photographies in black and white, and maybe he didn't realize that the model was colored. Anyway, modernity cannot be reduced to the modern movement. This building, which today seems retrograde to us, was considered modern at the time of its construction. This is the Temple of Saint-Jean, built by a pair of Genevan architects in 1933. Evidently, the inspiration is German. Here is the Frauenfriedenskirche, a Catholic church built in Frankfurt in 1929. Here is the Ehrenhalle, the Hall of Honor of Nuremberg, built in 1930 to commemorate the soldiers who died during the First World War. In the second half of the 20th century, the so-called international style forms a new steamroller. For 30 years, the Americanization of the urban landscape was well and truly underway, fostered by the development of international organization, but also by the establishment of multinational companies and foreign banks. Geneva is home of headquarters and branches. The city is boosting the position as a crossroads It is a hub of a global network. The advent of open spaces alone symbolizes the hold of American architecture on local production, seen here in Zurich Insurance Building by Pierre Braillard. As for the copies, they are sometimes literal. You have in front of you the administrative building of the Laine Penguin by Jean-Marc Lamunière, and on the right, the crown hall of the German architect who emigrated to the United States, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, particularly active in Chicago. So, Geneva, Chicago, Chicago, Geneva. I started with Sullivan, I finish with Mies, but there are also, in connection with Geneva, all the other cities I mentioned, in order of appearance and without hierarchy: Chicago, Glasgow, Munich, Basel, Heidenheim, Paris, Saint-Pétersbourg, Angers, Lyon, Tours, Bordeaux, Lisbonne, Boston, Valparaiso, Buenos Aires, Baltimore, New York, Metropolis, Gotham City, Versailles, Verona, no, Wien, Frankfurt, Nuremberg, Chicago. And this is only a sample, each Geneva building, if we dig deeper in its history, reveals connections, sometimes expected, sometimes rather surprising, with other cities, other countries. So I come to the conclusion. Let's be clear. Geneva is not a city only made up of imported products. Of course, the city has its own identity. Copying does not prevent creation, and each edifice is unique. It makes sense in its context. It captures a particular light. It meets specific expectations. A Californian house built in the country of Geneva is not a Californian house. What I wanted to show above all was the ambition of a city that has risen to the level of the great capitals by appropriating globalized standards. The architects active in Geneva have interpreted, rewritten, and enriched in their own way architectural currents such as neoclassicism, the Beaux-Arts style, or the international style. It seems to be that in order to understand the architecture of the city, it's more relevant to grasp these logics of rewriting and circulation rather than to run after a hypothetical genius loci. If finally in art there are no borders, to use Victor Hugo's famous quotation, then genius has no place. There are only geniuses in motion who move incessantly from station to station. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, David, for a beautiful lecture, and any apologies on behalf of your English speaking is much overstated. I think that was handled very, very well. So thank you so much. Opening up a bit to the student questions, I know Camila Gonzalez, I know you have some questions, so please take it away.
Hello, David.
Hello.
David, pardon. Thank you for your presentation. It was really nice, all the pictures and the information about this beautiful city. My first question maybe is a little bit general, but I would like to know what is your opinion about, because these buildings that are like kind of replicas of repliques of another buildings were kind of expression of individual migration or a little amount of migration. But now, in nowadays, what are the physical and the material expression of the big amount of migration and exchange of citizens from different parts of the world?
Well, thank you for the question. What I wanted to show is what we today know as globalization is a phenomenon that was active in 19th century, maybe before, but in 19th century it begins, and after this it accelerated in the 20th century. It's not only a question of migration, because there are cases of Genevan architects who traveled and who take things from other places. I showed the case of the synagogue in Geneva. The building is very important for the history of the city. It's the first synagogue that was built in Geneva, one of the first in Switzerland. And the architect is an architect, he's active in Geneva. He came from Zurich. And as I said, he traveled to Germany, and certainly he is very aware of what happens in other countries, and he is very, certainly he knew the periodicals I mentioned. So it's a circulation of people, but it's also a circulation of media, and this is the aspect I wanted to underline. It's the mediatization of the architectural, of the models, of the pictures, of the postal cards, of some kind of images that change, I think, the practice of the architects.
Okay, thank you. The next question is related to the concept that you explained in the beginning, the génie du lieu. I think it's genius loci, the concept. So for me, it's important to know your opinion about if it's possible to continue using this concept in the cities, the actual cities, because you spoke about the opening and the international view and the international influence that the city has in those days. What is your opinion about the concept and how we can use it in these times?
Okay, thank you. I think you have noticed I'm not very fond of this concept. For me, it's problematic because it supposes that the places are an essence. It's too much essentialist for me. I think the places has no essence from the beginning of the world to today, but the places have histories. I think the history is it's a concept that is working very better. History of economics, of politics, of all kinds of things, social history, and this is the important when we we try to work on history of architecture or urbanism or something like that. The concept of history for me is very important in all the sense of the word. I think the heritage is well, is an architectural product, but it's also, and maybe it's first, history or a story. This morning I was very interested by the first presentation that showed that the city in Bahrain was modeled by the culture of the pearling, and all the city is the expression of this economic history, and the narrative of the pearling is very important in the project of the restoration. I think when we speak of heritage, we cannot avoid the narrative. It's completely linked to the to the architectural or the monuments or the places or things like that.
Can I make a last one?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Okay, so so we agree that the identity of a city is a really complex concept, because there is a lot of different actors and variables that hang out together. But how do you work in the administration of the city and part of the government of the city? Can you tell if the authorities take in account this really important concept of international identity for the expansion plans for the city? I don't know, maybe it's a really huge question, but just to know if it's an actor that is important to develop the city.
You mean the heritage concept? For the,
yes, the heritage,
yes.
And the cultural variety and the local identity that is international also.
Yes, I think, well, it's an Occidental tradition. I think the concept, sorry, the concept of heritage is it's a construction, it's an Occidental construction. And in Switzerland and in Geneva in particular, it has a long story since the beginning of the 20th century. It's at the beginning of the 20th century that the government decided to classify a certain number of buildings and to create the landmark label. And the buildings that were, I'm sorry, could I speak French, please?
Yes, I think so.
Yes.
For me, it's okay. I don't know if, yes, maybe we can.
Please, go ahead.
Ok. Non, ce que je voulais dire, c'est que au moment où on commence à classer les bâtiments à Genève, donc c'est en 1921, c'est la première vague de classement, et parmi ces bâtiments, il y a le musée Rat, le musée que je vous ai montré, et c'est assez intéressant de voir que parmi les bâtiments qui étaient très liés à l'histoire de Genève, et notamment les bâtiments religieux, il y avait ce musée qui est une espèce d'exemple très éloquent de ce mouvement néoclassique en fait qui se développe, disons, au détriment des spécificités locales. Tout ça pour dire que le gouvernement a toujours été très attentif à la sauvegarde du patrimoine, mais ce n'est pas seulement le gouvernement, c'est aussi la société civile qui est très attachée à cette question. Et d'ailleurs, le gouvernement a tout intérêt à bien préparer le terrain quand il y a précisément des projets de développement, de quartiers nouveaux. Préparer le terrain, ça veut dire examiner de façon très précise si dans le territoire convoité, disons, il y a des bâtiments qui pourraient relever de cette catégorie du patrimoine. Et si le gouvernement ne fait pas son travail, la société civile pourra toujours proposer via une procédure qui existe ici et qui s'appelle le référendum, proposer une votation populaire pour que finalement, au final, c'est le peuple qui décide si oui ou non les projets de développement peuvent se faire lorsqu'il y a des questions patrimoniales en jeu. Et ce qui est très intéressant à observer, c'est qu'en général, quand il y a un référendum avec des questions patrimoniales, eh bien, le peuple, la société civile s'oppose au développement et favorise au contraire l'objet patrimonial. I'm sorry for the French, okay?
Leila, are you happy?
Happy?
If she's happy with the questions and answers she had.
Yes.
I guess, very good. Finally, I guess we'll be opening up for the group discussion. But I was just wondering, while you were speaking, we see now, just receiving a report today, that retrofitting and renovating heritage buildings within an 80-year time frame is to be more sustainable than any new building. This is new data just from today. Do you see this as possible to make this net zero energy of architectural heritage without deteriorating the sort of idea of architectural heritage itself? Do you think this will be possible?
Well, maybe I'm not exactly the good person to answer to this. I think, but there is always a contradiction between the normative question, especially the question of the heating of the buildings, and the heritage question, because we cannot on ne peut pas transformer un bâtiment dans le sens de la question énergétique sans abîmer d'une certaine façon le patrimoine. Et alors, il y a des normes qui sont extrêmement présentes et que la loi oblige à suivre. Et notamment, par exemple, pour donner un exemple, c'est la question des fenêtres. Aujourd'hui, on oblige les propriétaires à changer les fenêtres des bâtiments pour des questions, pour des questions énergétiques. Et bien évidemment, les fenêtres anciennes, qui sont pas forcément très performantes de ce point de vue-là, eh bien, elles peuvent tout simplement disparaître. Donc là, on assiste à une chose, c'est à une disparition d'une substance patrimoniale au profit d'un objectif qui est évidemment tout à fait louable, qui est celui de la question énergétique, qui a pris une très très grande importance aujourd'hui.
Thank you so much, David. That concludes session 2, and Roberto, I believe, will take over to begin and enter the group discussion. So thank you so much, everyone, from session 2, and Roberto.
Okay, just a little technical things. If you can close your PowerPoint, David, so we can have all the full screen, everybody. So, another technical. No, don't worry, it's no problem. But this point.